In 1950, one of the most unbelievable alien abductions would occur in the state of Massachusetts. The case was documented and investigated by Raymond Fowler, a ufologist perhaps best known for his work on the Betty Andreasson Alien Abduction. Fowler would investigate many cases in New England during his time alive, and this case is surely one of the more interesting ones. In this episode, we will examine the 1950 alien abduction of 13-year-old Betty Aho. In 1950, Betty Aho was living an average American life for a pre-teenager. Betty was living in Westminster, Massachusetts, and frequently went out during the morning to play with other friends in the neighborhood. On one morning in the fall of 1950, Betty left her home and would have an experience she would never forget. Betty walked out of her home and after just a few steps, noticed something up in the sky. It looked like the moon, but the object was growing bigger and bigger. She then became paralyzed and passed out. Next, Betty woke up inside a mysterious room. It was brightly lit, and in front of her were three odd beings. The beings looked like typical gray aliens, being 3.5 to 4 feet tall with gray skin, large black eyes, and a slit for a mouth. The entities wore tight-fitted silver suits, something we have seen in many cases. The beings then began to glide toward her. Once they got close, one being raised his hand, and Betty would become incredibly tired. One of the entities assured her that she would be okay and that she could relax. They then escorted Betty, who was floating, into a room filled with smoke. There, Betty would hover mid-air over a table. After some sort of examination, Betty was taken to another room. In this area, two larger beings greeted Betty. They were around 5 feet tall and wearing overalls which were gray. They would inform Betty that they were going to show her something. Betty laid back on a bed and the beings put some sort of device in her mouth, similar to a mouthguard. It was uncomfortable for her, and as the beings noticed that she was uncomfortable, one would put its hand on her head. It relieved her symptoms, but Betty began to feel like she was spinning. Soon the ceiling turned transparent and a light flashed through it. She began to travel up through the ceiling. Whether her physical body left or not is unknown, but Betty traveled through some sort of tunnel containing various costumes of humans. It was as if she was in a museum and the beings had tracked how mankind had evolved. She next traveled through another area. This area appeared to have the history of the beings. There were different UFOs and different artifacts on display as well. Next, Betty was informed she would be meeting the One. The being appeared to be their leader or god. Whatever it was, it communicated with Betty, and the details of the conversation Betty refused to share. She would then return to her body on the craft. At this point, the beings would do something incredibly unbelievable. According to Betty, they removed her right eye and implanted something deep in her brain. The beings would run some more tests and exams, and Betty was then told she could return home. The next thing she remembered was being in a field by her home. Just nearby, Betty could see a craft parked in the field. It was shaped like a spear and had 3 legs. There on the field next to her, she saw 3 beings, one taller and 2 small. The small ones were carrying a light globe. This is an interesting detail, which we'll dive into in just a bit. The large being would then turn to Betty and tell her they would look after her and she would be okay. The entity informed her she would forget everything in time. What can we make of this incredible story, though? While this case was examined by a renowned ufologist, it doesn't appear this case was studied too in depth, or by others. It also appears to be somewhat choppy. Still, this doesn't raise any red flags, as it's very possible that many of her memories may have somehow been blocked. The entities even admitted they would block her memory of the event. Betty's memories appear to be conscious, and she also remembers seeing the craft in the field. Still, the details around her eye being removed and put back seems incredibly unbelievable. It's important to point out, though, there are a number of cases where abductees report the beings performing miraculous acts like doing surgery and leaving no trace. One other interesting detail in the case surrounds the beings holding white lanterns. While this seems like a detail easily ignored, we have seen this on multiple Street of Silence episodes before. In the Utsuro Bune incident, the being was carrying some type of box, albeit it wasn't glowing. Also, in the Virginia Giant case, the being was said to be carrying a glowing box. In that case, a boy seemingly was about to be taken, but his dog stepped up barking furiously, and it is thought the dog scared off the entities. In addition to the glowing box, many other characteristics of this case align with Betty's story. Betty suffered from paralysis and also described a craft we hear time and time again. Cases with adolescents and children are often difficult to examine. Many believe the cases have logical explanations, like lucid dreams or sleep paralysis. Still, it must be pointed out that adolescents usually don't suffer from the same temptations that drive adults. Also, it's typically easier for ufologists to spot deception. Still, though, it's not known how much Betty was pushed on her answers, or whether answers were even suggested to her. Unfortunately, it is not known what happened to Betty. Did she go on to live a normal life, or did she experience more abductions? Did she suffer any type of trauma later in life? It seems possible that the answer to at least one of these questions is yes. Let's hope, though, Betty was able to live a healthy and happy life.